My partner framed me for money laundering, stole everything I'd built, and destroyed my reputation. 3 months later, I inherited a ranch in Wyoming. I expected to find only a caretaker there, but what I found left me speechless. And the most shocking part was discovering that the same man who destroyed my life in New York now wanted my ranch. But before I tell you that story, click the subscribe button. Your subscription helps us continue to find and bring you these incredible stories. I was Claire Morrison, 42 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed power was everything. My office on the 47th floor of Manhattan had a view of Central Park, and I commanded one of the largest financial consulting firms on the East Coast. I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, building an empire I thought would define me forever. My life was meetings, million-dollar contracts, and the constant adrenaline rush of closing deals that changed corporate destinies. I sacrificed relationships, health, and even the chance to have a family, all in the name of success. But what I didn't know was that my own business partner, Richard, had been orchestrating my downfall for years. He planted false evidence of money laundering in my contracts, involving funds I didn't even know existed. On a Tuesday morning, federal agents stormed my office and handcuffed me in front of my entire team. The man I trusted with my life's work had just destroyed everything I'd built. The next 2 months were a blur of legal battles, frozen assets, and watching my reputation crumble on every business news channel. My penthouse apartment was seized, my Mercedes repossessed, and my so-called friends vanished like smoke in the wind. I found myself living in a studio apartment in Queens, surviving on instant ramen and the few $100s I had hidden in an old jewelry box. The worst part wasn't losing the money or the prestige. It was knowing I was innocent while the world branded me a criminal. Richard had covered his tracks so well that even my own lawyers started questioning my story. Every morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach, wondering if today would bring another humiliation. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake replaying every conversation, every contract, searching for clues I'd missed. The woman who once controlled millions couldn't even afford decent coffee anymore. That's when the letter arrived. It came on a Thursday, delivered by a tired-looking postal worker who probably had no idea he was carrying what felt like my only lifeline. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with my name written in elegant cursive I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from a law firm in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a place I'd never been and barely thought about. The words seemed surreal. "We regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Thomas Morrison." I'd never even heard of this uncle. Some distant relative my father had mentioned, maybe once in passing. But apparently he'd left me his ranch, complete with livestock equipment and what the letter vaguely described as operational challenges. I stared at those words for hours, wondering if this was some cruel joke or maybe Richard's final twist of the knife. But the papers looked legitimate, and frankly, I had nothing left to lose. 2 weeks later, I was driving a rental car through the endless highways of Wyoming, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to rolling hills to something that looked like a different planet entirely. I'd sold the last of my designer clothes and jewelry to afford this trip, keeping only the bare essentials stuffed into 2 suitcases. My expectation was simple. I'd find some aging cowboy caretaker, probably barely literate, who'd been maintaining the property out of loyalty to my uncle. I imagined myself explaining the situation in simple terms, maybe offering him a small payment to help me understand the basics before I figured out how to sell everything and start over. The ranch would be my way back. I'd liquidate the assets, pay off my legal debts, and maybe have enough left to disappear somewhere warm and anonymous. As I drove past endless fences and cattle, I practiced the conversation in my head, preparing to be patient with whatever simple country wisdom would be offered. After all, how complicated could running a ranch really be? The GPS led me down a dirt road that seemed to stretch into infinity, past weathered fence posts and fields that probably hadn't seen rain in weeks. When I finally pulled up to what I assumed was the main house, I was surprised by how well-maintained everything looked. The farmhouse was painted white with blue shutters, surrounded by gardens that showed obvious care and attention. There were modern solar panels on the barn roof and equipment that looked far more sophisticated than I'd expected. I sat in the car for a moment, gathering the courage to face whatever conversation was coming. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my purse and the folder of legal documents, then walked toward the front porch with what I hoped looked like confidence. The wooden steps creaked under my designer heels, shoes that now seemed absurdly out of place but were among the few decent things I had left. I knocked on the door, rehearsing my introduction one more time. The door opened, and my entire world shifted on its axis. Standing before me wasn't the grizzled cowboy I'd imagined, but a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a boardroom. He was tall, probably 6'2", with steel gray hair perfectly styled and piercing blue eyes that seemed to analyze me in seconds. His clothes were simple, jeans and a button-down shirt, but they fit him like they'd been tailored, and his hands, while clearly working hands, bore the telltale signs of someone who'd once worn expensive watches. When he spoke, his voice had the cultured tone of someone educated at prestigious universities. "You must be Claire Morrison," he said, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm James Patterson. I've been managing this property." The way he said managing made it clear this wasn't just some hired hand waiting for instructions. This was a man who commanded respect, and I had the sinking feeling that every assumption I had made about this situation was about to be proven wrong. I wasn't expecting. I started, then stopped myself, realizing I was about to admit I'd assumed he'd be nothing more than a simple ranch hand. His slight smile told me he'd understood exactly what I wasn't saying, and somehow that made everything worse. "I'm here about the inheritance," I managed, holding up the legal documents like they might explain everything that didn't make sense. James nodded slowly, his eyes moving from my face to my completely inappropriate outfit to the rental car that was already covered in dust. "Yes, I've been expecting you," he said, stepping back to let me in. "Though I have to say, Ms. Morrison, you're not quite what I expected either." There was something in his tone, not quite dismissive, but definitely measuring, that made my spine straighten with familiar defensiveness. As I stepped into the house, I realized that whatever challenge I thought I was facing had just become infinitely more complicated. The inside of the house was nothing like I'd anticipated. Hardwood floors gleamed under tasteful lighting, and the furniture was a perfect blend of rustic charm and modern sophistication. James led me to a living room that could have been featured in Architectural Digest, complete with leather-bound books and artwork that definitely wasn't purchased at a local thrift store. "Can I get you some coffee?" he asked, and I nodded, still trying to process the disconnect between my expectations and reality. As he moved toward what I assumed was the kitchen, I noticed his movements were precise, controlled, the way successful people move when they're used to being in charge. When he returned with 2 steaming mugs, the coffee was perfect, and the cups were real china, not the chipped ceramic I'd been drinking from for months. "So," he said, settling into a chair across from me, "I imagine you have questions." His tone was polite but guarded, and I realized he was studying me just as intently as I was studying him. Something about this entire situation felt like a chess game where I didn't know the rules. "I guess I should start with the obvious," I said, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You're not exactly what I expected to find managing a ranch in Wyoming." James's smile was thin, almost amused. "And you're not exactly what I expected from Thomas Morrison's great niece, either." There was an edge to his voice that made it clear he'd already formed some opinions about me. "Let me guess, you're here to assess the value, liquidate everything, and get back to whatever high-powered career you left behind." His accuracy was uncomfortable, and I felt my defensive walls slam into place. "What I do with my inheritance is my business," I replied, hearing the ice in my own voice. "Though I am curious why someone like you is playing cowboy in the middle of nowhere." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. His expression hardened, and suddenly the polite veneer disappeared entirely. "Playing cowboy." James stood up, his full height making the room feel smaller. "Lady, I've been keeping this place afloat for the past 3 years while your uncle battled cancer and you were apparently too busy to even know he existed. His words hit like physical blows, and I felt my face flush with shame and anger. I didn't know about him, I said defensively, but James was just getting started. Of course you didn't. Too important to maintain family connections, right? Too successful to care about some old man dying alone in Wyoming. He moved toward a desk in the corner and pulled out a thick folder. Well, congratulations, Miss Morrison. You've just inherited a financial disaster that's about to bury you. He dropped the folder on the coffee table between us with a thud that seemed to echo through the room. Your uncle owed $847,000 to various creditors. The property taxes are 6 months behind, and we've got exactly 30 days before the bank forecloses on everything. My hands shook as I opened the folder and saw the numbers. Bills, overdue notices, loan documents with terms that made my financial consultant mind reel with horror. How is this possible? I whispered, scanning page after page of debt. Your uncle was a proud man, James said, his anger giving way to something that looked like grief. He refused help, kept thinking he could turn things around. By the time I realized how bad it was, he was too sick to make rational decisions. I looked up from the papers to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You knew all this when I arrived, I said slowly. You knew I was inheriting a nightmare. James nodded grimly. I was hoping you might be different from what I assumed. Hoping you might actually care enough to fight for this place. He gestured toward the window, where rolling pastures stretched toward the mountains. But looking at you now, I'm guessing you'll be on the first flight back to wherever you came from. You don't know anything about me, I snapped, but even as I said it, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. 3 months ago, I would have been exactly the person he was describing. I know enough, James replied. Designer clothes, manicured nails, rental car that probably costs more per day than most people around here make in a week. He sat back down, but his posture remained tense. I know you've never worked with your hands, never worried about whether there'd be enough money for feed or veterinary bills. His assessment stung because it was largely accurate, but something about his dismissive tone triggered a fury I hadn't felt since the day I was arrested. You're right, I said, standing up so quickly that coffee slopped over the rim of my cup. I don't know anything about ranching, but I do know about financial warfare, and I know what it looks like when someone is trying to destroy a business from the inside. I grabbed one of the loan documents and pointed to a name that had caught my eye. This loan modification. Who negotiated it? James frowned, clearly thrown by my sudden shift in focus. Some lawyer from back east. Said he specialized in agricultural debt restructuring. He leaned forward to look at the document I was holding. Why? My blood turned to ice as I read the fine print, recognizing the language patterns and terms that were Richard's signature style. Because I've seen this exact contract structure before, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. These aren't standard agricultural terms. They're designed to ensure default. I grabbed another document, then another, my hands moving faster as the pattern became clear. James, who recommended this lawyer to my uncle? His face had gone pale as he watched me work. I don't know. Thomas just said someone had referred him to an expert who could help restructure the debt. I felt the familiar rush of putting together a complex financial puzzle, but this time the stakes were terrifyingly personal. This is deliberate, I said, looking up to meet his eyes. Someone wanted this ranch to fail, and they've been systematically sabotaging it for years. The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the documents, spread across the coffee table, as if they were explosive devices. You're saying someone deliberately set Thomas up to fail. His voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Not just someone, I replied, my mind racing through the implications. The same person who destroyed my life 3 months ago. I pulled out my phone and showed him a news article with Richard's picture. This man, Richard Blackwood, he was my business partner. He framed me for money laundering and stole everything I had. James took the phone, studying Richard's face intently. I've never seen him before, but he stopped mid-sentence, his expression changing. Wait, there was someone who came by about 6 months ago asking questions about the property. Said he was a potential investor interested in agricultural land. My heart started pounding as the pieces fell into place. What did he look like? James's jaw tightened. Expensive suit, silver hair, about 55. Drove a black BMW. It was Richard. The bastard had been planning this for months, maybe years. James, I said, standing up again, but this time with purpose instead of anger. I know you think I'm some spoiled city girl who's going to cut and run at the first sign of trouble. I gestured toward the pile of debt documents. And maybe 3 months ago, you would have been right. I moved to the window and looked out at the vast expanse of land, feeling something shift inside me. But that man out there, he didn't just try to steal my career or my money. He stole my identity, my reputation, my entire life. I turned back to face James, and something in my expression must have convinced him I was serious. If he wants this ranch, then I'm going to make damn sure he doesn't get it. James was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those sharp blue eyes. Claire, he said finally, you have no idea what you're up against. This isn't just about money. This is about survival in a world you don't understand. I smiled for the first time since arriving, and I knew it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. Then I guess you'd better teach me, because I'm not going anywhere. The next morning, I woke up on James's couch with a crick in my neck and a determination I hadn't felt in months. He'd offered me the guest room, but something about accepting that level of hospitality felt too much like admitting defeat. Instead, I'd spend half the night going through every document in that folder, cross-referencing loan terms with agricultural standards I'd researched on my phone. James found me at dawn, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, my hair probably looking like I'd been struck by lightning. Find anything useful? He asked, and I was surprised to hear genuine curiosity instead of the skepticism from yesterday. I held up a loan modification that had been buried in the middle of the stack. This amendment here, it accelerates the full debt if the ranch misses 2 consecutive mortgage payments. But look at the dates. I pointed to the timeline. The modification was signed 3 days after your uncle made an on-time payment. Someone wanted to ensure he'd default, and they waited until he was too sick to read the fine print carefully. Jesus, James muttered, taking the document from my hands. I reviewed some of these with Thomas, but he insisted on handling the legal details himself. He ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked less like the controlled man who'd greeted me and more like someone carrying a heavy burden. I should have pushed harder, should have insisted on bringing in independent counsel. I watched him wrestle with guilt I recognized all too well. Richard is very good at making intelligent people feel like they're making their own decisions, I said quietly. Trust me, I know. James looked up from the papers, and I saw something shift in his expression. Tell me about New York, he said. Tell me what really happened. So I did. I told him about the evidence that appeared overnight, about watching federal agents carry out boxes from my office while my employees stared in shock. I told him about the money trail that led back to accounts I'd never opened, signatures that looked like mine but felt wrong when I tried to reproduce them. The worst part, I continued, staring out the window at the morning sun painting the mountains gold, wasn't losing everything I'd built. It was realizing that the people I trusted most were the ones who'd been planning my destruction. I turned back to James, who was listening with an intensity that made me feel heard for the first time in months. Richard had been my mentor when I started at the firm. He taught me everything I knew about high-stakes financial consulting. My voice cracked slightly as I remembered those early days. I thought he saw something special in me, thought he was grooming me to be his successor. James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a pattern that suggested he was working through something difficult. Claire, he said finally, I need to tell you something. The reason I recognize some of Richard's contract language, it's because I've seen his work before. My stomach dropped as I processed the implications. What do you mean? James stood up and walked to the window, his back tense with whatever confession was coming. I wasn't just any corporate lawyer before I came here, he said. I was a partner at Morrison, Keller and Associates in Chicago. We specialized in white-collar defense. The name was familiar. I'd heard it mentioned in the same breath as the most prestigious criminal defense firms in the country. About 5 years ago, we represented a client who was accused of securities fraud. The case was complex, involving offshore accounts and shell companies. He turned to face me, and I could see the weight of old regrets in his expression. The lead prosecutor was relentless, had built what seemed like an airtight case. But there were inconsistencies in the evidence, patterns that didn't quite make sense. I felt my pulse quicken as I began to understand where this was heading. We traced some of the questionable evidence back to a financial consultant who'd been working with both the prosecution and several of the supposed victims. James's voice was barely above a whisper now. The consultant's name was Richard Blackwood. You defended someone Richard framed, I said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. James nodded grimly. We proved our client was innocent, but by then Richard had disappeared from the case. Claimed he'd been misled by fraudulent documents himself. He moved back to the table and sat down heavily. The experience broke something in me. I'd gotten into law to seek justice. But watching how easily the system could be manipulated, how innocent people could be destroyed by someone skilled enough to work from the shadows. He shook his head. I had a complete breakdown. Panic attacks, insomnia, the works. Eventually, I just walked away from everything. I stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of this coincidence. That's when you came here. James smiled sadly. Thomas Morrison was my great-uncle too, Claire. Third cousins once removed, or something like that. When I needed somewhere to disappear, he offered me this place. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. We were family, distant but family nonetheless. Before I could fully process this information, the sound of a car engine cut through the morning air. James and I both moved to the window, watching as a sleek black BMW pulled up the driveway, the same car James had described from Richard's earlier visit. Son of a bitch, I whispered, recognizing the license plate. It was Richard himself, and he was getting out of the car with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. What's he doing here? James asked, but I was already moving toward the door. Probably here to make an offer he thinks we can't refuse, I said, my voice tight with controlled fury. The question is whether he knows I'm here. We watched through the window as Richard adjusted his expensive suit and checked his reflection in the car's tinted windows. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 months ago. Silver hair perfectly styled, predatory smile, and that aura of untouchable arrogance that had once impressed me. Now it just made me want to hit something. Richard knocked on the door with the kind of authoritative rap that suggested he was used to being welcomed wherever he went. James and I exchanged a look, and I saw my own determination reflected in his eyes. Let me handle this, he said quietly, but I shook my head. We handle this together, I replied. When James opened the door, Richard's practiced smile faltered for just a moment as he took in both of our faces. Mr. Patterson, he said smoothly, recovering his composure. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. His eyes moved to me, and I saw the exact moment he recognized me. The smile didn't change, but something cold and calculating flickered behind his eyes. And Ms. Morrison, what an unexpected pleasure. His tone made it clear that my presence was anything but pleasurable for him. I was just in the area and thought I'd check on how you were handling your inheritance. The way he emphasized inheritance made it sound like a burden he was generously offering to lift from my shoulders. How thoughtful of you, I replied, stepping forward so I was shoulder to shoulder with James. Though I'm curious how you even knew about my uncle's death, since we've never discussed my family. Richard's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Word travels fast in financial circles, Claire, especially when it involves people who've had legal troubles. The casual cruelty of the comment was designed to remind me of my supposedly ruined reputation, but instead it just fueled my anger. "I am actually here with a proposition," Richard continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "I represent some investors who are interested in agricultural properties in this region. They're prepared to make a very generous offer for this ranch, enough to cover all outstanding debts with a substantial amount left over." He set the folder on the porch railing between us. "Of course, you'd need to accept quickly. Real estate markets can be so unpredictable." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. James and I both stared at the folder, but neither of us moved to open it. After a moment that stretched like a held breath, I smiled back at Richard with all the warmth of a winter morning. "That's very kind of your investors," I said, "but I'm not interested in selling." Richard's expression darkened when I refused his offer, but he maintained that practiced composure I had once admired and now despised. "Claire, I think you're making an emotional decision based on unfortunate circumstances," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." The suggestion made my skin crawl, but James stepped closer to me, a silent show of solidarity that Richard couldn't miss. "I don't think that's necessary," I replied coldly. "Mr. Patterson and I are partners in this venture now." Richard's eyes flicked between us, calculating something I couldn't quite read. "Partners," he repeated slowly. "How interesting. Well, I hope you both understand that time is not on your side. Agricultural properties can be so vulnerable to unexpected setbacks." He picked up his folder and headed back toward his car, but paused at the driver's door. "I'll be in touch soon," he called back, and something in his tone made it sound more like a threat than a promise. As his BMW disappeared down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind. The sabotage started that very night. James woke me around 3 a.m. with urgent shaking, and the smell of smoke thickened the air. "The barn," he said grimly, and I stumbled outside to see orange flames licking the roof of the main storage building. We worked together with garden hoses and buckets until the volunteer fire department arrived, but by morning, thousands of dollars worth of feed and equipment were reduced to ash and twisted metal. "Electrical fire," the fire chief concluded, but James and I both noticed the cut fence line behind the barn and the tire tracks that didn't match any of our vehicles. 2 days later, we found 3 of our best cattle dead in the north pasture, victims of what the veterinarian politely called unknown toxin exposure. The pattern was clear. Richard was escalating his pressure, and he didn't care about collateral damage. That's when I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back with the weapons I knew best: financial investigation and strategic warfare. I spent the next week buried in my laptop, using every database and contact I still had access to trace Richard's recent activities. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The ranch scheme wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic operation spanning at least 12 states. Richard had been targeting agricultural properties for years, using complex financial instruments to force defaults, then swooping in through shell companies to acquire prime real estate at fraction of market value. "Look at this," I told James, showing him a map I'd created marking his known victims. "Farms in Nebraska, ranches in Montana, orchards in California, all following the exact same pattern." James studied the screen, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "How many families has he destroyed?" he asked quietly. I'd been afraid he'd ask that question because the answer was staggering. "At least 47 properties in the last 5 years," I replied. "Probably more that I haven't found yet." The scope of Richard's operation was breathtaking in its cruelty and efficiency. That's when James made a suggestion that changed everything. "What if we contact some of these other victims?" he asked. "If Richard's been using the same playbook everywhere, there might be people willing to help us fight back." It was brilliant in its simplicity. Richard's greatest strength was also his weakness. His systematic approach meant there were dozens of people who'd lost everything to his schemes, and many of them probably had evidence we could use. I started making calls, and the responses were immediate and furious. Sarah Chen, who'd lost her family's vineyard in Napa Valley. Tom Rodriguez, whose cattle ranch in Texas had been foreclosed on 6 months before his daughter's wedding. Maria Kowalski, whose organic farm in Vermont had been destroyed just as she was gaining national recognition. Each conversation revealed new details about Richard's methods, and more importantly, each victim had kept meticulous records of their interactions with him. Within 2 weeks, we'd assembled what James called the most motivated legal team in American history. 43 victims of Richard's schemes, along with their lawyers, accountants, and family members who wanted justice. We organized through encrypted messaging apps and video conferences, sharing evidence and coordinating our response. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. We would use the ranch as bait, making Richard believe he was about to close his biggest score yet, while secretly documenting every aspect of his operation. James reached out to his former law partner in Chicago, who agreed to coordinate with federal prosecutors. I used my financial expertise to trace money flows and identify the shell companies Richard was using. But the most satisfying part was setting up the trap itself, a fake financial crisis that would make the ranch appear vulnerable while actually strengthening our legal position. The confrontation came sooner than we expected. James and I were reviewing our evidence files one evening when we heard multiple vehicles approaching the house. Through the window, we watched as Richard's BMW was followed by 2 SUVs filled with men who definitely weren't lawyers or real estate investors. "He's escalating," James said quietly, and I saw him reach for something behind the desk, a hunting rifle that hadn't been there yesterday. "Claire, you need to get out of here," he continued, but I was already shaking my head. "We do this together," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Besides, I'm not running anymore." Richard approached the house with 3 large men flanking him, and his usual polished demeanor had been replaced by something much more dangerous. When James opened the door, Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. "I think we're past the point of civilized negotiation," he said, and his companions made it clear that this wasn't a social visit. "I'm going to make this very simple," Richard continued, pushing past James into our living room without invitation. "You're going to sign over the property tonight, and you're going to disappear. Permanently." His men spread out through the room, and I noticed one of them was recording everything on his phone. "And if we refuse?" I asked, standing up from the couch where I'd been pretending to review documents. Richard's smile was genuinely frightening now. "Then accidents will continue to happen. Barn fires, poisoned cattle, maybe some personal tragedies." He gestured toward his companions. "Rural areas can be so dangerous, especially for city people who don't understand the risks." That's when I played the card I'd been holding in reserve. "That's interesting," I said, pulling out my own phone, "because 43 other victims of your little real estate scheme are probably watching this conversation right now." I held up the screen, which showed a live video conference with faces I'd come to know over the past weeks. "Everyone, say hello to Richard Blackwood." The color drained from his face as he realized that every word he'd just spoken had been broadcast to a room full of prosecutors, FBI agents, and very angry people who'd been waiting years for this moment. The chaos that followed was swift and decisive. Richard's expression shifted from predatory confidence to genuine panic as he realized the scope of what he was facing. His hired muscle looked uncertain, clearly not prepared for a situation involving federal law enforcement and live-streamed evidence. "You have no idea what you've done," Richard snarled, but his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. Within minutes, we could hear sirens approaching. James had triggered a silent alarm system he'd installed after the barn fire, and the FBI agents who'd been coordinating with our network had been stationed just minutes away. Special Agent Martinez, who'd been working Richard's case for 2 years, personally placed the handcuffs on him while reading his rights. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit extortion." Watching my former mentor led away in handcuffs was surreal, but the overwhelming emotion I felt wasn't satisfaction, it was relief. The nightmare that had consumed my life for months was finally ending. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed once the full scope of Richard's operation became clear. With 43 victims providing testimony and documentation, along with the recorded confession from our living room, the federal prosecutors had enough evidence to fill several filing cabinets. Richard's network of shell companies unraveled like a cheap sweater, revealing assets worth over $50 million that had been stolen from farming families across the country. The frozen accounts from my own case were unfrozen within weeks, and my legal team managed to recover not just my original assets, but substantial damages for the intentional destruction of my reputation. More importantly, every family Richard had victimized received restitution that allowed them to rebuild their operations. Sarah Chen reopened her vineyard. Tom Rodriguez expanded his cattle operation, and Maria Kolsky's organic farm was thriving again. Justice, it turned out, was even sweeter when it was shared with people who understood exactly what you'd lost. 2 months after Richard's arrest, I received a call that I'd been expecting but dreading. "Claire, it's Margaret Hoffman from Steinberg and Associates," the voice said, and I recognized the name of one of Manhattan's most prestigious consulting firms. "We've been following your case, and we're impressed by the financial detective work you did in bringing down the Blackwood operation." She paused, and I could hear the careful calculation in her voice. "We'd like to offer you a position as our head of forensic financial investigation. Full partnership track, salary that's triple what you were making before, and your own team of analysts." It was everything I thought I wanted: vindication, financial security, and a return to the world where I'd once felt powerful and important. But as I looked out the window at James repairing fence posts in the morning sun, I realized that what I wanted had fundamentally changed. "Margaret," I said slowly, "I'm flattered by the offer, but I'm going to have to decline." Instead, I made a different kind of business proposal. James and I incorporated Morrison Patterson Agricultural Consulting, specializing in helping family farms identify and defend against predatory lending practices. Our first case came from the network of Richard's victims, and word spread quickly through farming communities that had learned to be suspicious of anyone offering financial assistance. Within 6 months, we had clients in 15 states and a waiting list that stretched into the following year. The work was challenging in ways I'd never experienced. Instead of maximizing profits for wealthy corporations, we were helping families save the land their great-grandparents had homesteaded. James handled the legal aspects while I focused on financial analysis, and together we developed strategies that protected agricultural properties from the kind of systematic exploitation Richard had perfected. It wasn't the glamorous world of Manhattan consulting, but it was work that mattered in ways I was still learning to understand. The personal evolution was harder to navigate than the professional one. James and I had been through a crisis together that bonded us in ways I'd never experienced with anyone. But the transition from desperate allies to something more intimate was complicated by our shared trauma and very different backgrounds. He was patient with my city-bred ignorance about ranch life, teaching me to ride horses and understand the rhythms of agricultural seasons. I was aggressive about modernizing the business side of ranch operations, implementing digital tracking systems and financial planning tools that increased our efficiency dramatically. Our first real fight came when I wanted to install a state-of-the-art security system, and he thought it was paranoid overkill. Our first real moment of understanding came when we successfully delivered our first calf together at 3 a.m, both of us covered in mud and exhausted, but exhilarated by the miracle of new life. Somewhere between those extremes, we found a partnership that worked both professionally and personally. The anniversary of my arrest, what I had once thought would always be the worst day of my life, became something entirely different. James and I were sitting on the porch after finishing our evening chores, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that still took my breath away. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, and I knew he meant the life I'd left behind in Manhattan. I thought about it seriously before answering. "I miss the adrenaline sometimes," I said honestly. The feeling of closing a big deal, of being the smartest person in the room. I reached for his hand, calloused now from months of shared work. But I don't miss feeling empty every night, wondering if any of it actually mattered. He squeezed my fingers gently. Richard's sentencing is next week, he reminded me, and I nodded. 25 years to life, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Justice served, finally and completely. A year later, Morrison Patterson Agricultural Consulting had grown into a company with 12 employees and offices in 3 states. The ranch was profitable for the first time in 5 years, and James and I had paid off every penny of my uncle's debts with money left over for improvements and expansion. More importantly, we'd prevented 17 farm foreclosures and helped 43 families refinance predatory loans into sustainable payment structures. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the pay was a fraction of what I'd once earned in Manhattan. But every morning I woke up knowing that the day ahead would involve solving problems that mattered to real people, and every evening I fell asleep next to a man who'd chosen to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. Richard's final appeal was denied last month, and I felt nothing when I heard the news. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just the quiet peace of a chapter finally closed. I'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destroying your enemies, but building a life so fulfilling that their memory couldn't touch it. The scared, broken woman who'd arrived at this ranch 18 months ago felt like a stranger now, and I was grateful for every painful step that had brought me home.